The Trumpet Daily from Jerusalem.
Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to the Trumpet Daily. Today I'm speaking to you from the Valley of Elah, the site of David's famous confrontation with Goliath, which is recorded in 1 Samuel 17. Elah means oak or terebinth, a tree that's common here in the Mediterranean region. Now, east of this valley, not far from here, is Adullam, where David, along with 400 of his men, hid in caves when Saul was trying to kill him. You can read about that in 1 Samuel 22. There's also a fascinating excavation located at Kirbat Kiapha, right here in the Elah Valley, just a little ways to my right. It's yet another dig that's been uncovering a lot of evidence that supports the biblical account of a united monarchy under King David. For today's program, we're going to focus on a story that nearly everyone knows, but almost no one believes: the epic battle between David and Goliath. Let's begin in 1 Samuel 17. That's where you read of this struggle on the day of that battle. This was over 3,000 years ago, happening right here in this valley. The Philistines were encamped on the south side of the Elah Valley, which is where I'm standing here today. And the Israelites would have occupied the hill just to the north, right across the valley on the other side. We'll start in 1 Samuel 17 here. In verse 2, it says, "And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together and pitched by the Valley of Elah and set the battle in array against the Philistines." So we're reporting right here from the battle scene to help you envision it. Verse 4 continues, "And there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines, named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span." The Philistines, which had been a constant thorn in the side of the Israelites, sent their champion warrior out into the valley to taunt the armies of Israel. And now this was no ordinary warrior, as it goes on and describes. Verse 5 continues, "And he had an helmet of brass upon his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass, and he had greaves of brass upon his legs, and a target of brass between his shoulders, and the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and one bearing a shield went before him." So here was this giant, perhaps 9 or 10 feet tall, wearing about 300 or 400 pounds of armor. Verse 10 continues, "And the Philistines said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard the words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid, it says. Now Goliath was there taunting God's army, and the men of Israel were cowering in fear. And this went on for well over a month. You can see that in verse 16. Now during that time, David was tending to his father's sheep just out in the fields about 20 miles to the east of us here. David's 3 oldest brothers were encamped on the hill across the valley. They were in the army. They had been enlisted into Israel's army at the time, but they were greatly afraid, just like all the others. And David enters the scene of the battle at his father's behest. Jesse had asked David to deliver some bread and cheese to his 3 brothers. Now picking it up in verse 19, it says, "Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the Valley of Elah," it says here again, "fighting with the Philistines. And David rose up early in the morning and left the sheep with the keeper and took and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the trench as the host was going forth to the fight and shouted for the battle." So here is described a young man who is eager, who rises early, who arranges for a substitute to look after all of the sheep, who obeys his father's command. David, as we discussed in the last program on this subject, had a wonderful spirit. He had a heart like God's. And God loved that about David, this courageous spirit of this young teenage warrior. Verse 21 says, "For Israel and the Philistines had put the battle in array, army against army. And David left his carriage in the hand of the keeper of the carriage and ran into the army." Here's the first reference in this chapter about David running. He had the victuals for his brothers. he stops the chariot and he takes off running to meet with the Israelite army. It says, and he came and saluted his brethren, and as he talked with them, behold, there came up the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, out of the armies of the Philistines, and spake according to the same words. And David heard them. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were sore afraid. So this was obviously a time when Israel needed a courageous leader to step forward and to fight for God. But all of the oldest, all of the best trained warriors in Israel, they scrambled for cover during this standoff. None of the men would stand up and fight. And so God used this remarkable teenager instead. Verse 25, and the men of Israel said, have you seen this man that is come up? Surely to defy Israel is he come up. And it shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel. And David spoke to the men that stood by him, saying, what shall be done to the man that kills this Philistine, and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? With his whole heart, David wanted to remove this reproach from Israel. And notice he also asked there, well, what shall be done to the man who kills this giant? He knew that there would be incredible rewards also waiting for the individual who is willing to sacrifice everything for God. Verse 27 says, and the people answered him after this manner, saying, so shall it be done to the man that kills him. And Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spoke unto the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David. And he said, why did you come here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? Eliab says, I know your pride and the naughtiness of your heart, for you are come down that you might see the battle. Now Eliab, remember, was the oldest brother in the family, the one that Samuel looked at, and immediately he assumed that this must be the one that God wants me to anoint. He must be the future king in Israel. And I would think that Eliab at this point was still in a state of shock and dismay at the fact that he had been passed over for his baby brother, basically. And so he attacked David's character. He said David's heart was wicked and full of pride. Now God, on the other hand, said David had a heart just like him. This shows you that when you step out, no matter what your age might be, when you step out and act courageously for God, when you do that, those that are standing on the sidelines watching will often scoff at you, saying, well, you're just arrogant, or well, you're just going on and on about your work. But notice, David was not to be deterred. Notice his response. This is verse 29. And David said, what have I now done? Is there not a cause? Now his older brother had just said he had this wicked and prideful heart. But David wasn't going to be drawn into this sibling rivalry, not at this time, not at this moment of crisis. Isn't there a cause before us, he asked? Isn't there good reason for us to face our fears, to confront this arrogant enemy that just keeps coming back into this valley and taunting our armies? The soldiers on that northern hill over there, they had already lost the battle in their minds. David, however, came in from the fields. He came in fresh from the fields, where he spent so much time talking with God, dwelling on the things of God. The soldiers' minds were probably dwelling in the past and the present, thinking about their failures. In the case of Eliab, he was dwelling on all the weaknesses of David, all of his youthful weaknesses. But David's mind was on the future. David's mind was on what God would do. David's mind was on how God would deliver Israel. And he had had many experiences with God's miraculous intervention. These incidents along the way had encouraged him and inspired him and strengthened his faith, fighting a lion, fighting a bear, defending little sheep. Now put yourself in this situation. How often do we fail to stand up for God's cause. God uses people, even teenagers, who stand up for His causes. In David's case, if there was a godly cause, that aroused a fighting spirit in that teenager, that boy. Verse 30 says, "And he turned from him toward another, and spoke after the same manner, and the people answered him again after the former manner." So David was here like Joshua and Caleb after they had spied the land of Canaan, coming back and trying to convince the Israelites, the hard-headed Israelites, that they could whip these Philistines. Verse 31 says, "And when the words were heard which David spoke, they rehearsed them before Saul, and he sent for him." So Saul, upon hearing this, sent for David. Saul's tent was probably set up somewhere behind the army lines there. And when he heard the commotion, when he heard this from the messengers, he sent for David. The margin there, it says he took him. You get the feeling that David almost had to be physically apprehended because he was so anxious. He was so eager to get out onto the battlefield. And he wasn't even in the army. Verse 32 says, "And David said to Saul, 'Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine.' And Saul said to David, 'You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you're but a youth. And he's a man of war from his youth.'" You see, here Satan was trying to plant this seed of doubt in the young man's mind, young David's mind. But David, as I say, would not be deterred. Verse 34 says, "And David said unto Saul, 'Your servant kept his father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear, and took a lamb out of the flock, and I went out after him and smote him, and delivered it out of his mouth. And when he arose against me, I caught him by his beard, and smote him, and slew him.'" And David fought a lion and a bear for one little lamb. What a spirit, what an attitude. This was no superhuman feat. David was just an ordinary teenager, but he was physically fit. He was a talented individual, as I covered on the last program. He was strong and athletic. He put the 7 laws of success into practice for sure. Now clearly David's faith is what delivered him out on this battlefield, but don't discount the fact that after spending days, months, years of his youth out in the wild, that David learned how to confront his fears, even dangerous obstacles. Verse 37 says, "David said, Moreover, the Lord that delivered me out of the paw of the lion and out of the paw of the bear, he will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said unto David, Go, and the Lord be with you." Here's David giving God all of the credit. God delivered me in these previous trials and tests, and God will deliver me today. And Saul, who used to have a close relationship with God, he had drifted far from God by this point in the story, but he told David to go, and God be with you. Verse 38 says, "And Saul armed David with his armor, and he put an helmet of brass upon his head. Also he armed him with a coat of mail, and David girded his sword upon his armor. And he essayed to go, for he had not proved it. And David said unto Saul, I can't go with these, for I have not proved them. And David put them off him." So there's a lot of lessons we can take away from this story. By this point, as I say, Saul had been rejected by God. He was really an instrument of Satan in many ways. He dresses the young boy up into all this heavy armor. David was about to leave for the battlefield. That's what that word essayed means. He tried to leave. He tried to go out initially, but he caught himself as he was departing, probably thinking, what am I doing? This isn't me. This isn't how I fought that bear. This isn't how I went after that lion. I didn't go looking for all of this heavy armor. I just acted in faith, and God backed me up. David realized by this point that while others may consider all these accoutrements helpful and necessary in the battle, he found that they weighed him down. And instead he went off and used the specific talents and abilities that he had developed in his upbringing. How about that? All of those many months he spent working with his sling, all of that time that he spent chasing after predators. Now he was going to put it to use in a real test, a nation-changing test. David stripped off all the non-essential clutter that Saul had heaped upon him, and he grabbed his slingshot, and he headed for the creek. He headed for the brook of Elah, which we visited just before coming up to this hill. Right there, carving its way through the valley. It's dry during the summer months, but during the winter months, you'd be able to see the creek, just as it was back then. And David went down there to gather, as you know, some stones for his sling. Verse 40, and he took his staff in his hand, and he chose him 5 smooth stones out of the brook, and he put them in a shepherd's bag, which he had, even in a scrip. And his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. 5 stones. He chose 5 stones. As we've often pointed out, I mean, David was a remarkable teen with so much faith in God, and here it shows that he had some wisdom too. He knew that if nerves got the best of him on that first go-round, he'd have a few backups. He had enough stones to go after Goliath again. Verse 42 says, and when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth and ruddy and of a fair countenance. And now compared with Goliath, of course, David certainly looked scrawny and small, but he wasn't a weakling, as I noted. He was strong and robust, very healthy, very agile and quick, coordinated. He must have been. Verse 43 continues, and the Philistine said unto David, am I a dog that you come to me with staves? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh unto the fowls of the air, and to the beasts of the field. The critics will laugh and ridicule. They'll always do that, just as Goliath did here. But David didn't even respond to these kinds of criticisms. He was concerned about staying in the battle. He was concerned about keeping his focus on the fight. Verse 45 says, then said David to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword, and with a spear, and with a shield, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. I mean, these are the types of leaders that God is looking for. Those that will stand up to satanic attacks and face it down with God backing them every step of the way. Verse 46 says, this day will the Lord deliver you into my hand, and I will smite you and take your head from you. And I will give the carcasses of the host of the Philistines this day unto the fowls of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And all this assembly shall know that the Lord saves not with the sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. Now, as warriors of God, here's the key to our success. Knowing that though we have our part in the fight, knowing that we've got to play our role, it's not really our battle, is it? God is the one who fights for us. God is the one who wins for us. And all he wants, all he needs, are men and women who know that God will back them, that God will fight for them. We just have to find that simple sling and search for a few smooth stones. Whatever our talents might be, maybe it's something different than that, something that God can use. Develop those talents and then act. Have the faith to act, and God will help us to prevail. Verse 48, and it came to pass when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David hasted and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. Remember when he was delivering the food, he got off the chariot and ran to the army to fulfill his father's request. Here, as soon as the Philistine rose, David ran out to meet him. David took off. I heard a lecture recently from Joel Hilliker, who writes for the Trumpet.com, talking about facing a fear that he had in an obstacle course, and how that to conquer it, he just ran after it. He ran after it and just tore right through that obstacle and got to the other side and thought, well, that was a little easier than I thought it would be. And it made me think about this verse a little bit differently and about what that teenage boy must have had going through his mind. Even though he was confident when he tried to convince Saul, even though he was confident when he tried to convince his brothers and others on the hill behind me that someone needed to fight this Goliath, still he was a teenager. Still he was an ordinary man who had to fight fears and struggles and blocks in his mind, just like we do. But David, when it was time to fight, he ran, and it didn't even give himself time to question or to doubt. He just acted in faith. And that's the way we have to be when we confront our struggles, our obstacles, our Goliaths. Verse 49 continues, and David put his hand in his bag and took thence a stone and slang it and smote the Philistine in the forehead, that the stone sunk into his forehead, and he fell upon his face to the earth. David got him with one shot. He nailed the Philistine with one stone. And he must have, when he got through that obstacle, thought, well, this was a little easier than I thought it would be. God took care of that obstacle for him. God fought the battle for him. Verse 50, so David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and smote the Philistine, and slew him, but there was no sword in the hand of David. That's what the scripture points out. Samuel saw fit to highlight the fact that all David had was a little sling and a stone. He didn't even have a sword, and yet David prevailed. That's because God was with David. Now let's conclude over in 2 Samuel chapter 21, the second book of Samuel. We'll move forward in the story. David has been king now for some time, and the kingdom is set up. He's ruling from Jerusalem. And let's read a little bit about this kingdom. The kingdom of Israel, 2 Samuel 21 and verse 15, says, moreover, the Philistines had yet war against Israel, and David went down, and his servants. So here are the Philistines. Again, they're a thorn in their side of the Israelites, and they're battling with them again. It says, and his servants went down with David and fought against the Philistines, and David waxed faint. So here's another battle. Only this one, David was growing tired from the constant struggle, the fight. He was out there at the front of the lines and growing weary. And notice what happens. Verse 18 says, and it came to pass after this, that there was again a battle with the Philistines at Gob, and Sibbachai, the Hushathite, slew Seph, it says, which was of the sons of the giant. And there was again a battle in Gob with the Philistines, where Elhanan, the son of Jari, it says, a Bethlehemite, slew the brother of Goliath, the Gittite, the staff of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. It continues, and there was yet a battle in Gath, where was a man of great stature that had on every hand 6 fingers, and on every foot 6 toes, 24 in number. And he also was born of the giant. And when he defied Israel, Jonathan, the son of Shimeah, the brother of David, slew him. These 4 were born to the giant in Gath, and fell by the hand of David, and, it says, and by the hand of his servants. So all of these giants now were killed either by David or by David's men. Now years earlier, back when this battle took place, back here in the Valley of Elah, the whole nation of Israel was terrified at the thought of confronting Goliath. But all of that changed. All of that changed the day a young shepherd boy ran out to confront an imposing giant of an obstacle. And that one act aroused a courageous fighting spirit in all of Israel. There's a proverb that says, the wicked flee when no man pursues, but the righteous are bold as a lion. Now that kind of boldness and courage, as we see with this example of David and Goliath, it comes through faith in God. Now with all of this history, God is trying to teach us that if we just look to Him and then run out to confront our greatest fears, God will deliver us. We'll become conquerors. Thank you for joining us again today, and we'll see you again next time on the Trumpet Daily.